So up to this point, all the data we're working with is dummy data, and it's not permanent. If we register ourselves as a coach, once the app reloads, it's no longer there. The data is lost. In addition, of course, it's only here on our computer. If this would be a web app running on a server being served to users all over the world, every user would only see his or her own data and not the data of other users, which of course is totally not the idea behind an app like this. I want to see all coaches from all over the world, after all. That's why we now need HTTP and why we need a backend, a server on which we can store the data. For that, I'll again use Firebase, not because it's the only option, but because it doesn't require us to write any server-side code, and this of course is no server-side code course, so that's great, and because we can get started for free. If you want to use it for your real projects though, of course definitely check out the pricing page to learn what costs money and how much you can get for free. Now, you need to log in with your Google account and then go to the Firebase console. And then there, simply create a new project, which I did. And there, you should then go to real-time database to make sure you use this database for your project. Now, for the moment, this is empty. When it gets created, make sure you create it in test mode and ensure that your rules over there look something like this. They should not say false here or anything like that. Instead, they should look something like this. And with that done, we can now get started and use this as a backend to which we send requests from inside our Vue app. And now, of course, the question is, where do we want to send which request? Well, in the end, it's quite simple. In our app, when we register as a coach, we want to send a request as soon as this is done. When we're on the coaches page, we want to fetch all the coaches and also refetch them whenever the refresh button is pressed. On requests, we want to fetch all requests, and we want to send a request once this contact form is submitted. So in the end, this aligns with our Vuex store. In coaches, when we have this register coach action, we want to send a request to create a coach. In requests, when contact coach is submitted, we want to send a request to add this coach on the server. And then we'll need a couple of requests to fetch data. I still want to use Vuex to manage my data in the Vue app, and I want to use Vuex for sending those requests. And therefore, let's maybe start with coaches. Here in Actions, in Register Coach, we're creating our coach data object at the moment. And that's the object that should be sent to Firebase. So therefore here, we want to send a request. We can do this with fetch, with the fetch function that's built into the browser. It takes a string, which is the URL to which the request should be sent, which is this URL in your real-time database, or at least that's a part of the URL. But then you can add any segment thereafter, for example, /coaches, and then for Firebase, you need to add .json at the end. But that's only a Firebase thing, nothing Vue specific. So this will send a request there. But by default, that will be a GET request. A GET request is useful for getting data, but here we want to store a coach data. Hence, we need a second argument, an object, where we configure the kind of request we want to send. We can do this with the method key, and we could set this to post. But I actually don't want to, because here's one assumption which I'll make. The ID of the coach will exist before we register as a coach. Because later we'll add authentication to this app, and you will need to sign up before you can register as a coach anyways. So you need to sign up, and then in addition, you can also become a coach if you want to. Therefore, I assume we already got the user ID who wants to become a coach. And we kind of do. In our root state, we got this dummy user ID. Now later, once we added authentication, this will no longer be a dummy ID, but for the moment it is. So for the moment, I'll just take this. So in this action here, we already get this ID here, I'll no longer add it as an ID field in the coach data. Instead, I'll store it in a separate constant, user ID, like this. And then actually here, point at /coaches/ and then this user ID to create a separate entry on Firebase for just this user. Now to conveniently add this user ID into this string, I'll use backticks instead of single quotes here, which allows us to use this JavaScript feature of injecting data into a string like this with this $ curly brace syntax. So now we send a request to Firebase /coaches/ this user ID /JSON. And I'll send a put request, which tells Firebase that data in there will be overwritten if it existed, or will be created if it didn't exist yet. And the difference to post is that with post, a new entry would be added all the time, which I don't want to do here. I only want to have one coach entry per user. Now we still need a body though. We need to attach some data, and that is the JSON stringified version of our coach data. So that converts this object into this JSON format, which we need to send along with the request. So this sends a put request to this URL with this data. And now we of course only want to continue with the next steps once this is done. Now fetch returns a promise, as you learned, so we can use then to define the code that should execute once this promise is done. Or we use an alternative, a more modern syntax, the async await syntax. It makes your code look like it's regular code without promises, though it still uses promises behind the scenes. But it's a bit easier to write and maybe also to understand, so that's why I want to switch to that different syntax here. To use it, we need to add the async keyword in front of our method name. And then we can use the await keyword in front of our promise, so in front of the result of calling fetch. Then we can store the result in a regular variable or constant, and it will actually only be stored once this is done. So it's a bit like putting this into the then block we saw before, but now the code is, working without the then block. It's transformed behind the scenes though. So that's the response we get back from the request, and the next line will now only execute once this request is done. So here we know we'll have a response, and then we can get our response data by awaiting response.json, because response, this object, has a JSON method which also returns a promise. So we await that, and then we get the parsed response data eventually. We can then check if the response should not be OK. The response object has an OK field, which indicates whether the response was OK or not. And then here we had an error if that would execute, but we'll take care about error handling later. So for the moment, I'll do nothing there. Instead, I assume that it always works for this moment, and then thereafter we can commit our data. Actually, I'll commit a different kind of data. I'll commit an object where I copy coach data with the spread operator. So I take all the key value pairs in coach data and merge them into a new object. But in addition, I add an ID field which holds the user ID. I did not want to send this along to the server because I already store it under that ID in a separate node on the server. So I would then just be using the ID twice there. But I definitely do want to add it to my locally committed data here, so that we still have the coach ID quickly available in our data object here in Vuex. So then committing still works as before, and this will only execute once all these promises are done. By the way, I'm not doing anything with response data here, so I guess we can also delete this or comment this out. Now data should be stored on the server when we register as a coach. Let's give this a try. Let's reload, click register as coach, and enter your data. I'm a web developer, online instructor, and I love sharing my knowledge. Hourly rate, check the boxes, click register, and we see nothing here. But after a short while, we see the coach appear. And that kind of looks good. Now, if we check Firebase, we see a coaches node with our dummy coach ID, and then below that, the data that belongs to that coach. So this is looking very good. Submitting the data worked. Now, there are a couple of areas we could improve. For one, for example, we were redirected here, and we only saw the coach show up after a couple of milliseconds or seconds. But in addition, in general, we're not fetching the coach data here. If I reload this app, I still see just the dummy coaches. Now that we got at least one real coach, it would be nicer to fetch that, right? So that is what we should do next. Make sure that we don't just store coach data on the backend, but that we also fetch it from there.